Welcome, Randy Milch. Randy, you co-chair the NYU Center for Cybersecurity. You're a distinguished fellow at the Raisch Center on Law and Security and a professor of practice as well at the NYU School of Law. Prior to coming to NYU, you served as general counsel and head of public policy at Verizon Communications. There you chaired the Verizon Executive Security Council, and that entity basically oversaw security across all of Verizon's operations, including national security matters. Randy, what do you see as the primary drivers of our cybersecurity vulnerabilities?
So the core drivers, if you want to look at the core drivers, you really have to step back, right? I mean, we're living in a golden age of interconnection. We've got ubiquitous and cheap broadband, and we've got cheap and incredibly powerful computing combining with the ubiquity of the internet, right? So everything is interconnected by the internet. And there's a lot of positive about this. I don't want to think that this glass is entirely empty. It's at least half full. And it's all built, this edifice of wonderful intercommunication is built on a, unfortunately, insecure foundation. The security was not one of the aims, one of the desires when the people who put together the internet and the internet protocols were doing their work. Security was not among the items that they built for. And so security has forever been an afterthought. And even though we're making some strides to make it a little bit less of an afterthought, we have a technical debt that we have to work down from the security standpoint, just in the foundational aspects of the internet. So we are where we are because we like it. We like the ability as individuals to interconnect and put our data and utilize our data and interconnect with businesses, and businesses like the ability to meet their customers online, and they like the efficiencies associated with connecting their products and their services and their infrastructure to the internet. We like this, and that's why we are where we are. Really, that's why we're insecure. That's why we're cyber insecure. Is because we're embracing an intentionally insecure thing.
Okay, given that we have in essence embraced this insecure thing, what can we do about it on a high level?
What can you do about that? I don't pretend that we can go back in time and ask MinSurf to recreate the protocols with security in mind. That's obviously not going to happen. And it's conceivable that the insecurity, the current insecurity of the internet, will drive folks away from it for certain uses, right? Will drive individuals who get a little better to acting a little bit more prudently with their data, drive companies to not connect everything to the internet, drive people to disfavor internet connected refrigerators or whatever it is that some may say don't need to be internet connected. So there's a possibility that we're undergoing enough of a evolution in maturity that as individuals, we will lower the threat level and businesses will lower the threat level by eschewing some of the benefits that we now embrace. That's entirely possible. I don't give it a lot. I don't think that that's a near-term sort of solution. And I don't see governments, I don't see the US government in particular ordering people to do this. It's simply not a conceivable use of its power to my mind. Instead, I think that we have to, as an old boss of mine used to say, major on the majors. And we have to figure out ways to incentivize businesses and individuals to incrementally increase their cyber awareness and their ability to make better cyber choices and to invest in cybersecurity on an incremental basis. Absolute security is not an achievable goal. And so we have to take 1,000 small steps to do better in cybersecurity, and we can discuss some of the details of some ideas that I have in that regard. But I think that is the fundamental problem, and the fundamental response is going to be exerting resources where it makes the most difference, and exerting government sanction and government power and government direction in the areas where it could have the best effect. And not spend our time at this juncture worrying so much about, in my own view, personal information and worrying a lot more about pipelines and energy grids and financial sectors and the like.
Randy, do you see any potential for consumers, be they corporations or individuals, to require higher levels of cybersecurity in their purchasing of relevant goods and services?
The standard level of interest in cybersecurity is bifurcated, right? I think if you asked people, is cybersecurity important, they would say yes. I think that if you ask them, what steps are you personally willing to take to enhance your own cybersecurity, they would both be clueless and then unlikely to actually take very significant steps. And that's based upon my experience that selling security and using security as a value adder in the marketplace and the like it's tough. It's a tough sell. The second aspect of this that is a little bit of a hurdle, which is slowly being overcome, is that it's very difficult to deal with the claims of security, right? It's very there are few, if any, external markers.
Can you elaborate on external markers?
There's no sort of underwriter's lab that compares to aspects of insurance. Now, UL is actually branching into the cyber area. There is efforts to do sort of comparative work on software. So there are some beginnings in this area, but without some sort of a valid external guide and marking system to allow consumers to make comparisons. I think it's very difficult to hope that will be useful, right? I mean, an external marking guide, an external guide that companies would have to submit to and be graded on and compared about, and thus consumers could make those choices. I think that's entirely possible, but it's not here yet.
Randy, can you lay out what you think is actionable by corporations, especially those in the critical infrastructure context, as well as government?
Cybersecurity is not an end state. Cybersecurity is a process. And it's a process that brings with it both technical and non-technical obligations. Indeed, in many of the frameworks, in many of the sets of requirements that NIST has put out, if you look at them in detail, many of the obligations, and depending on which one you look at, the word most may not be applicable. Many of the obligations, though, are non-technical obligations, right? Organizational change and organizational appreciation of cybersecurity is a critical item and needs also to be dealt with here. And I think that this is, in some respects, because so much of the technical aspects of this are essentially part of an arms race between the good guys and the bad guys, that we can't forget the organizational aspects of this, the organizational debt that has to be overcome in order to achieve better cybersecurity. And this is particularly in the critical infrastructure areas and and I look at that there. I mean, remember, cybersecurity is essentially a corporate problem. Critical infrastructure in the United States, overwhelmingly in the 80s to 90% is owned by private entities. It's not owned by governments. Now, governments are their own issue, right? Governments are a huge infrastructure holder and data holder, and governments need to do much better on their cybersecurity, as we witness all the time from the state, the local, the federal area. I mean, the hacks at every level are becoming legion. But primarily, the critical infrastructure area is a corporate problem, both public corporations and private corporations. And so understanding how corporations can be incented, and I apologize for the use of that verb, can be brought to the notion that they need to invest more in cybersecurity and they need to reform themselves both organizationally and technologically in order to be better in cybersecurity. That's a critical goal. And since cybersecurity is a process, in my view, it's 100% security is unattainable. We need to embrace the process aspects of this and to thereby, incrementally and continually increase our ability to deal with cyber problems. And this is both prevention, and mitigation and resiliency. I mean, it's all aspects of this, right? You can't assume that you're going to keep the bad guy out of the door. You have to assume the bad guys within your perimeter. These are all things that the real technical cyber gurus will tell you, I'm sure, in much more precise and better detail. And so, not only prevention, but resiliency and mitigation are critical aspects of things to prepare for, to spend money on, to prioritize.
Randy, you mentioned the importance of incentivizing corporations to improve cybersecurity. Given your extensive legal background, can you lay out the various dimensions of the legal rationale or incentive for investing in cybersecurity?
So cybersecurity operates at a number of different levels inside a corporation. So first, you're going to think about whether you're in a heavily regulated space, right? And telecommunications was in a heavily regulated space, has been traditionally heavily regulated from both the state level and the federal levels for 100 years. And so knowing where your regulators are going to demand of you is a principal part of what is going on.
Okay, so there's regulatory requirements for cybersecurity, some of which will be sector specific. What else in terms of the legal rationale?
Then there is the litigation aspect of this. So outside of investigation and dealing with your regulator, if God forbid there's a breach, you're going to get sued. And anyone who's looked at the large breaches that have happened, note that there are literally hundreds of class action lawsuits in many instances that are brought to bear and consolidated and represent a large threat, right? It's a large threat to a company. The litigation aspect of this is particularly unsettled at the moment.
So how does the prospect of litigation inform how much you should be spending on cybersecurity?
From an economic view, a rational holder and processor of other people's data will invest at least up to $1 less than what they expect to pay out in a claim to avoid that claim, right? They get better security, they avoid the claim, and everyone's better off from a rational economic basis.
Cyber attacks have moved from a major focus on data theft to an escalation in ransomware, which has had increasingly operational impacts on corporations as of late. Will this change the litigation dynamic?
Yes, this will change, I think, the nature of it, because I would imagine that the lion's share of the lawsuits that will arise from these operational problems are going to be business-to-business lawsuits. And those business-to-business lawsuits will, I think, be governed more likely by contracts, by the contractual relationship between the two entities, Colonial Pipeline and the people to whom Colonial Pipeline sold.
What about reporting requirements around cybersecurity?
I think that we're in a race to find lots of little ways to change the incentive structure for corporations. Certainly the SEC very recently in 2018 put out new guidance about disclosure, right? The corporations' disclosure obligations, public corporations' disclosure obligations in the cyber area. And just this year, this late this spring, we saw the first SEC enforcement action based upon this 2018 guidance. And this was the aspect of the guidance that was important about disclosure actually was below disclosure. That is, what kind of controls and processes and procedures does a public corporation have in place to ensure that its disclosures around cybersecurity are accurate? And that sort of effort to insist upon appropriate processes and procedures like Sarbanes-Oxley type procedures, right, and controls to ensure that information is gathered, is assessed, is analyzed, is passed up the stream, up the corporate chain, so that appropriate decision makers can have it. And if the SEC were to, as it has shown some willingness to do just recently, enforce that, right, that is the kind of incentive changing behavior for incentive changing effort that a regulator, in this case horizontally, right? This is the SEC acting as the regulator for all public corporations, not simply the regulator for the financial industry, part of the financial industry where it is the vertical regulator. This is a horizontal effort. Is important, right? I think that kind of will drive different behavior for public companies. Now, public companies are vastly a minority of the companies in America, and so you have to think about how are you going to extend this sort of process aspect to private companies.
What about wider gap reporting, which encompasses both public corporations as well as privately held corporations?
Can you change GAAP in some way to require this set of processes in a non-financial area? There's going to be debates about this, right? The SEC could be involved here, right? Because the SEC controls the PCAOB. The PCAOB tells the accounting agency, the accounting firms what to do, what they have to account, what they have to audit against. So there's a route for this sort of a change. And that would, again, be a horizontal obligation on companies, and it would be enforced through the auditing process, right? Auditors would have to take on new responsibilities, and it would be a process check. They wouldn't necessarily be saying, do you have, what firewall do you have, and is it the right firewall? That might be a little bit obviously out of the wheelhouse for a standard audit. But do you have the kind of processes and procedures and controls in place to ensure that the director or the CEO or the CFO knows somehow, right, whether there's been an analysis of the right firewall, and they can, and that is something that has to be signed off on through increasing layers.
How about litigation safe harbors?
I think that those safe harbors, if there were sufficient teeth, if there were perhaps associated with them obligations to undertake an audit every year to claim it, or something in the like, something of the same nature, or to hire a third party expert to state that you're meeting whatever framework or goals that you say you're meeting for the safe harbor, that would be a useful addition to a safe harbor concept, that there's actually third party auditing or third party certification of the steps, and would take away some significant aspect of the criticism, I think, in that regard. But I think it's a great idea, and I think that it ought to be further explored.
Randy, thank you for allowing us to tap your diverse background and insights. In terms of key takeaways, what would you offer to decision makers in both the public and private sectors?
I think I would start with making sure people remember that we are so interconnected because we want to be that way. And remember that cybersecurity is not the first thought on everybody's mind, certainly not to the extent that they're willing to give something up to get more security. I think that, particularly in the critical infrastructure realm, we need to balance affirmative commands by regulators with notions of taking steps that incentivize behavior, right? Incentivize certain behavior. And by incentivizing behavior, I mean providing things that corporations actually really want, liability protection or insurance or something else, with obligations that will go along to increase cybersecurity and give them the things that they desire in order to achieve that state. Again, cybersecurity is not the only risk that companies face. They need to have incentives to understand and bring that risk into proper alignment with the other risks that they face. Next, I would say we need to figure out ways, both within critical infrastructure and outside critical infrastructure, sort of on a horizontal basis. How do you change corporate incentives? Is it through changes in SEC rules, through accounting rules, through insurance rules, sort of the kind of everyday aspects that will increase cybersecurity, not only at the biggest companies, but at the smallest companies, right? Because all the way through, we have supply chains and we have interconnectedness that require more cybersecurity everywhere, not just in the biggest companies, but in their vendors and in their vendors' vendors, all the way down the supply chain.